Welcome back to the Command Your Brand Show. I'm your host, Josh Silvestro, brand ambassador of Command Your Brand, where we help CEOs and founders get on top-rated podcasts. You definitely check us out on YouTube or any other place. In this episode, we're going to do something different. We're going to be talking about American history, the culture, how it is changing for us men and women, and how it affects us today. So definitely check us out. And before we get into today's conversation, I want you guys to like and subscribe to this channel, and definitely check us out on www.commandyourbrand.com. All right? Enjoy the show. All right. So welcome back to the show, to the Command Your Brand Show. So we have a very interesting guest here. So I really want to emphasize this, how this amazing person who just came on my show is now just, I always want to ask the people, the great people, these questions because I always question it myself, like what is a woman or what is a man or any of those things, So I really want to introduce this person who is an amazing, amazing entrepreneur. He is a podcast host. He's, just a very educated individual in the area of, our history, our culture. And I really want to introduce this man who is just beyond educated in many different ways. So I'd like to introduce you guys to Alex Petkas. Welcome to the show, Alex.
Hey, Josh.
Good, man. So I guess
a high bar to live up to.
I know it's very high, right? So I guess what I want to kind of go over, and it was funny. I was talking to my fiance about this. It's like, and there's actually funny enough, there's a movie coming out, or there was a movie and now there's a second one, but it's like, we're talking about today's, our culture of like between men, women, what their jobs are, who should do the roles, who shouldn't do the roles. Can they both do roles? Can they be the opposites? Everything. So I kind of want to just dive deep into that, just in terms of, your input, because I know you're very educated in this space. I guess just tell us like a little bit about yourself first off. Like just tell us who you are, more of who you are, and I guess your background.
Yeah. So, thanks for that. And I think that it's funny because my wife and I also have many conversations about roles, and we have over these. We've been married for something like 15 years now, and our thinking has kind of changed with the culture, and I've reflected a lot. So my background is I am an academic by training, though not by practice anymore. I did a PhD in classics, in the ancient Greeks and Romans at Princeton. And, I went through the whole academic track of applying for jobs. I was a visiting professor for a few years, finally got a tenure track job. And I left academia during COVID in 2020 for the world of entrepreneurship. And I guess why did I become an academic is maybe an interesting question. So I had a lot of, when I was young, my father was working on a business that was struggling, that eventually he did all right. But, when I was in high school, he was not around a lot, and my parents got divorced. And I went through like a rough patch, really, in high school. I was overweight. I was playing a lot of video games. I didn't have a lot of friends. I was like, my grades were terrible, experimenting with drugs. So everything went wrong. And I didn't feel like I had strong models of what to aspire to. Somehow I turned my life around in around my junior year, 17 years old, lost a lot of weight, started getting into exercise, but I started looking for more answers. I found in our bookshelf, we had a copy of Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic emperor, and his meditations. And I read some of that, and I was like, wow, there's some wisdom out there. And I read 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I was like, wow, there's some wisdom out there. There's a lot of wisdom in books. And I turned to the Bible too. I got interested in Christianity, it's the religion I've been raised in. So, but I felt like I started my senior year of high school to see, there's actually books that we are reading in school. Every now and then we'll read, there'll be an assigned book that, usually I would have just completely ignored the assignment and not done the reading and just taken the D or whatever. But suddenly I was starting to be interested in this idea of like, you could get wisdom from books. And so we read some things like Beowulf, Sophocles' Antigone, and just a couple of things that sort of sparked something in me. I was like, wait a sec. You can actually like improve in your life from reading books. And it could, because I used to be just reading sci-fi and fantasy, and they were fun and entertaining. But so I think that kind of got me on this quest of like, what can we learn from like the wisdom tradition, and how can it improve my life? And I got kind of obsessed with this question of like the origins of Western civilization, our own wisdom tradition. When I was in college, that's how I kind of ended up doing a PhD in classics and learning ancient Greek, which is a whole other story that became a great passion of mine. But I left in 2020. Long story short, I just felt like as an academic, our discipline of classics has just been very kind of captured by bureaucratic thinking, very kind of, everybody knows about the woke movement now, and it's just completely seized the control of the rudder in our discipline. I just felt like I was not going to be able to share this wisdom in an impactful way if I just kept, doing what I was supposed to do as an academic. And so that's kind of how I ended up to where I am today.
That's interesting, because I really like that, because, I always find history is, something we can all learn from, between, all the wars we've been through, all the things that we have gone on in history. And it's really interesting is like, how just things, even just in a very small time period, in like 10 years, let's just give it that, where people just kind of drop things that we've done in the past. And now it's like totally out of history of like what we're normally doing. Like, I was just talking to somebody. He's like, "Oh, well, I don't do this anymore." And I was like, "Well, why not?" Because it's like there's like a man and there's a woman type. What we were talking earlier is about the roles that people do. And it's like, "Oh, I don't do this anymore. It's kind of up to this person." It's kind of like interesting how like just things, and you see in history between the Bible and just the just daily life, just things drop out, and it's like not even part of our culture anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, I think in a lot of times people, when they're turning back to history to look for how should they live their daily lives, they're kind of asking this question, like, what is the natural way for humans to be? They sort of have this sense in a very civilized society where, you're raised far away from nature, and, you don't have to hunt, you don't have to gather, you don't have to fight lions. Like, you really want to know what is the most natural way for humans to be. And I think that's one of the reasons that people, I think, have turned in particular to ancient history, because we kind of get further away from all this incrustations of civilization that have maybe warped our brain. And it's one of the reasons I think that the ancient Greeks in particular have been like an enduring interest for a lot of individuals, but also like a lot of philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche and Emerson and so on. So I continue to find it inspiring and action guiding for sure.
Yeah. So I guess, and like, what do you think, and for you, because I know you like this subject and you like to teach, between history and how to, in a better sense, how to make a man a better man, So I guess for like people who are listening, because I have a lot of people who are like entrepreneurs, and a lot of, some of them are women and some of them are men. And, I guess a lot of them like don't know sometimes what roles they should play in cultural aspect, because a lot of us are, we're all entrepreneurs, and we're all trying to do this and we're all trying to do that. And, for you, I guess, what do you as a man, and you and I as a man, like, what do we strive for in terms of being who we are supposed to be? Like what do you think would be the best advice you would give to someone who's just like, gosh, I don't even know who I am anymore, because like the world is just changing so much,
Yeah. Well, I think that my simple answer, I like to think I follow my own advice, is study heroes. And what I mean by that is, after I left academia, I started this podcast, The Cost of Glory, because I had this feeling that, and it took me a while to really figure this out, honestly, that heroes have a really important moral function in like, not just in kind of making more heroic men, but making men in general be the best version of themselves at every level. So I got really interested in this ancient philosopher, Plutarch. So Plutarch is, he's kind of the inspiration for my podcast. He wrote this very, very influential set of books that used to be bestsellers throughout, from the Renaissance on to the American founding fathers, the 19th century. He's kind of gone out of fashion in academia. And I don't think that was an accident. But so Plutarch wrote, it's a biography collection of parallel lives. And he's basically written the lives, the biographies in short, digestible form of 48 or so just amazing men of Greece and Rome, heroes. And Plutarch is a student of Plato and Aristotle, the philosophers. I mean, he lives several centuries later, but he's following their teachings. And I think he had this crucial insight that in order to live your best life, you should pursue virtue. Okay, that's not his insight. That's all the philosophers tell you that. Mm-hmm. But Plutarch really took this thing that he got from both Plato and Aristotle, that storytelling in particular is really, really key to our like moral formation as humans. And we kind of learn how to be virtuous. We learn how to be excellent. We learn how to like work hard. We learn how to be courageous, mainly from watching other people, especially in stories, especially like this is how morals have been transferred from generation to generation, especially like at the highest level, like the aspirational stories, the kind of character traits that make people capable of becoming leaders. Like these you have to instill by heroic storytelling. That's I mean, other philosophers kind of hint at this. Seneca will hint at this. But Plutarch said, I'm going to put all my chips on this one principle. And so he wrote this just classic of Western literature, the parallel lives. And in it are guys like Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great. And not just those guys, but the men around them, the men who they looked to as heroes. Cicero, the great Roman orator, looked to Demosthenes, the great Greek orator. Julius Caesar, famously, he's like 30 years old. He's on a tour of duty in Spain, and he finds himself in this temple of Hercules and standing before a statue of Alexander the Great, who lived about 250 years before him. And his friends see him weeping. And they're like, Caesar, what are you doing? Crying in front of a statue. He's like, yes, don't you realize how many things this man accomplished when he was my age, and I haven't done a tenth of them. So like there's this whole pattern of, you can see heroes honoring other heroes, and you can see this all played out in Plutarch's lives. And so what I recommend for men is like the heroic is there to bring out the best in you. And it sounds really it's like deceptively simple. But we really need to like listen to these stories, read these stories. And so what I'm doing in my podcast is basically retelling in as much detail as is convenient, but like trying to stay concise, the biographies of the heroes from Plutarch's lives. So I'm on a tear right now, and I'm going to get to Julius Caesar shortly, but I'm not right now doing some of the men that were around him that influenced him, his father-in-law, et cetera, et cetera. So that's been very, very impactful for me when I leaned into that myself, kind of later in life, in my 30s. Like, this is it. This is what we need to be doing much more. And these things were taken out of our culture kind of on purpose over the course of the 20th century, which is a whole nother story.
Mm-hmm. I know it's funny. It's interesting. I don't remember who says. I don't know if it was my grandfather. I'm Italian, by the way. So my family imported here from Sicily, my father's side, and I'm sure you've heard this before. The saying where it feels like everyone says this aspect, but it's like there's no such thing as mistakes, and there's no such thing as on purpose. It's really it's all planned out, and I guess like. For you, like if let's just say magically someone were to come back, who do you think the best person should come back as from ancient history to redo our history books and redo our history that we have today? Yeah,
I love Plutarch, of course, and there's just so many of the biographies that he covers are these great statesmen. I mean, a lot of people. Elon Musk recently was tweeting about one of Plutarch's heroes, the general Sulla, who famously started and won an incredibly bloody Roman civil war and slaughtered all of the corrupt people and oligarchs in Rome. So Elon's like, maybe we need another Sulla. But I think for myself, and I did a series on Sulla, and I think he's a fascinating character that could deserve some more attention today. Not necessarily for the whole mass murder thing, but he had other real qualities that people loved him for. But I think that for me, the hero that inspired me, and he's not typically considered a hero by a lot of people, is Plato, the philosopher Plato. And Plato is a person that people often kind of get forced to read in intro freshman seminars in college. He's a famous name, founder of Western philosophy and yada, yada. But Plato, actually, speaking of your Sicily connection, Plato was also this great man of action. He's a great risk taker. He's a great entrepreneur. And he founded a school, and he founded a kind of school that didn't exist before. Like before Plato, there was no idea of like a philosophical school where you could go and study philosophy. And Plato because Socrates was his teacher, the famous Athenian philosopher going around bothering people in the street, asking them about, what principles they base their life off of. And Plato was a student of Socrates, but Socrates didn't really have a school or a set of doctrines. He was just like a very charismatic teacher. Plato kind of turned Socrates into a brand.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that he founded his school is by going to Sicily. And there were, at the time in Sicily, the island was ruled mostly by the city of Syracuse, the most influential city, Syracusa, and it was ruled by tyrants in Plato's day. Dionysius the First was this, kind of like the Mussolini of the 4th century BC, kind of charming, frightening, incredibly powerful. But Plato visited the court of Dionysius because Dionysius was interested in having literary men around him. He's interested in having artists and poets and thinkers. And so Plato kind of goes on an invitation, and he tells some stories and makes some connections, but it's like a very disappointing experience for him at the end of the day, because he sees it's kind of shallow. There's just like a lot of hedonistic partying and orgies and fancy feasts, and it's just not his scene. But he meets a couple of people there that he ends up developing lifelong relationships with, and he comes back 20 years later as like a middle-aged man, and he ends up kind of becoming a tutor to the son of the tyrant, Dionysius II, who, the guy's uncle became Plato's friend. And there was like some hope that this kid was, moldable according to the teachings of philosophy, that he would like bring about more liberty for his state, like that he would be a kind of enlightened monarch instead of a despot. And Plato took a lot of reputational risk on that. And he traveled, from Athens to Sicily is a very dangerous sea journey. There's pirates and there's hostile forces. And Plato just invested a lot in these relationships because he was trying to build a brand. He was trying to start a movement. He was interested in like getting good people in political office in Greece. And I think that, if Plato weren't to come back today, at least what we could do is learn from his example that like philosophers, I think, and intellectuals who have something to teach us, we should expect them to like have some skin in the game, stake something on it. Because so many of our teachers today have these kind of secure salaries and comfortable positions, and they don't have to, face any
consequences,
real threat or consequences. If their teachings are stupid or useless or pernicious, nobody holds them accountable or even cares.
Right.
I think that this was very different from the way that it was in the ancient world, where all of the philosophers, all of the intellectuals are basically solopreneurs. There's no institution to give you a salary. There's no endowment. It's just you preaching what you've got to offer. And do people listen to you? Do people keep coming back because it works, or do they not? And I wish that I think we might be entering that age with the new media and the institutions of the universities sort of losing credibility. And that might be a good thing.
Yeah. What's interesting too is, I don't know, I obviously didn't go to the school you did, but it's interesting how some of the schools just almost are scrapping the idea of just all these historical people who've done these amazing things, who are amazing leaders, and just they're scrapping them because it's just like, there isn't enough care to actually learn about it, because it's just, it's not what we do today. You know what I mean? So it's like people's ideas are changing, and it's like, it could be bad, or it can get worse, or it can be okay, but it's interesting how, like, just the ideas of people, like, it's always that one person that just changes something, and then there's like a ripple effect, that just like, oh, but we want to get, all these leaders out. And it's just like, it's even today's culture. It's like, you look at the presidential things and just what's going on. It's just like, we want to kick people out. We want to, we don't want these people in, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not going to name names here, but like, you see a lot of that, you see a lot of that, let's get people, let's suppress the good, and let's bring out the bad almost, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, if people don't know history, and if they are insecure about their status in the world, they're easier to manipulate. So somebody's profiting off of that weakness.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think, the thing that we can all do, women and men, I think men in particular, is like become the best version of ourselves, and not give into that weakness.
Right.
And if there's one habit that I think you see in so many of the great figures of history, not just the ancients, but people like Alexander Hamilton or Napoleon, Nietzsche, Frederick Douglass, really across the political spectrum, it's they devote some time every day to a kind of almost like a reverential, like, devotion of reading about men that they admire, and studying their words, taking down notes in a commonplace book, copy down a quote from this guy, or like an episode in his life, and just try to learn it, like really meditate on the people you want to be like. Napoleon clearly doing this with Alexander and Caesar, and Hamilton with Julius Caesar as well, and other figures from the past. And so, like, this, you can self-educate. Hamilton's mostly self-educated. Napoleon, most of like the education that he got in oratory and kind of conqueror spirit was, his own practice, reading books after hours. I think that we can seize a lot of that back, that we maybe weren't given by our institutions. And I'm suffered from this myself. I went through a public school education in Texas, and it really kind of left me dry. Yeah. It didn't really give me any moral formation to speak of, or none that was good, I think. So
yeah.
I think there is hope.
Yeah. Now, I guess for people who are listening, a lot of us are in our own spaces or our own life. We're somehow a leader, or we're a doer, whether we're, a laundry doer, or we're running a business or whatever. What do you think, from your perspective, what practices or, ideas that people have gotten in the past, like from ancient history, what do you think would be most valued to people who are leaders, or even just men in general, or even women? Like, what do you think, what value do you think from the past, from, could be some ancient person, do you think would be most valued here today?
Well, I think that one of the things that I've benefited a lot from is there's 4 cardinal virtues in ancient philosophy. This is pretty common knowledge if you dabbled in kind of pop stoicism. Courage, justice, wisdom, and temperance, or restraint. But the foundation of all of them, according to the philosophers, is courage. Like, you can't really be wise without being courageous. You can't really be a just person. You can't really settle a serious dispute or intervene on somebody's behalf without courage. You can't really have restraint in a way that really matters without courage. And so I think this is one of the things that you get from reading stories of really courageous men and kind of thinking really deeply on their personal examples. There's one guy in particular that was a big inspiration for me for starting the podcast, The Cost of Glory. His name is, well, he's the secretary of Alexander the Great. And he was the secretary of Alexander the Great's father, Philip. So he's like a pencil pusher at the beginning of his career.
Yeah.
But after Alexander the Great dies as a young man, so he's conquered this big kingdom from, Greece to Afghanistan and Egypt and the Caucasus. Well, there's this, he hasn't selected a successor. And so all of his generals kind of tragically end up warring with each other to see who will be in charge, and then end up carving up the kingdoms amongst themselves. But there's this one guy, Eumenes of Cardia is his name, Eumenes. And people discover after Alexander dies that he's not just a great secretary. He's also like a military genius, and he becomes a warlord and a huge power player in this struggle. And he's trying to keep the kingdom together and pass it on to the legitimate heirs of Alexander. He's this incredible figure of loyalty. But the thing that made Eumenes not just a great secretary, not just a great literary man, but a great warrior was he was courageous. He was incredibly courageous. And there's these stories of him engaging in hand-to-hand combat with other generals and defeating them. It's amazing. And so there's this one scene that really inspired me. It's like this is in this war of succession early on after Alexander dies. Eumenes finds himself, he loses the battle, and he's stuck on a fort in the middle of Asia Minor and like modern Turkey. It's kind of desolate. And the fort at the top of this hill is like the size of a soccer field. It's tiny. And he's got 1,000 men in there and something like several hundred horses in there in this tiny little box at the top of the hill.
Yeah.
And he gets surrounded by this other general, Antigonus, another one of the great generals of the day, with, tens of thousands of men. They're sieging Eumenes, and Eumenes really feels like he has right on his side. He's like defending the right cause. And so Antigonus calls him down. They exchange hostages and they have a parley, and Eumenes comes down, and Antigonus is like, all right, Eumenes, surrender. I've got you surrounded. What are you going to do? And Eumenes is like, yeah, I'll surrender if you grant me my full army back and make me the governor of this large province nearby and restore to me all my honor. And Antigonus is like, come on, man. Shouldn't you be addressing me as a superior considering the circumstances? You've got these like tough guys in a box and I've got a huge army. And Eumenes says, well, as long as I have my sword, I consider no man my superior. And so he marches back up into the fort and just waits it out. And the negotiations come to naught. But within 12 months, the political situation has changed. And sure enough, he's once again at the head of a formidable army and fighting a war. And the story I've told in my podcast. But I think these moments of like meditating on the courage of great men, and following that up with your own practice, like I think it's good to train in martial arts and to do kind of tough physical things. Every ancient philosopher would have advised the same. It was like a given for men in the ancient world that you'd be training in gymnastics, you'd be wrestling, you'd be doing this stuff to keep your like physical sharpness there. But taking a story every day like that and thinking about it, thinking about how you can emulate that virtue is something that the philosophers all counsel you to do. Hold these men before your eyes, Seneca says. Imagine that you've got a Cato on your shoulder. Cato's another great philosophical hero. Imagine he's like watching you. I think that's really powerful. So that's one thing that I try to do. Yeah.
That's so interesting is like, I really love the fact that, because you're like an opinion leader for just people, not just the ancient history, but just for men. And I think it's really cool that like just how you instill, even just for me, I feel like, like for me, I'm 29, just to give you a little heads up on my age. So like for me, it's like, I think probably the most interesting thing, and I think I sort of people take it for granted, is history and how history kind of came to be to what we have today, and I really love the fact how you kind of give me an insight on just more how I can be a better man and a better husband, or a better friend, or whatever, or a better leader even, and I think it's amazing. But go ahead.
Well, I think that's what history is supposed to do for you. And history has gotten so academic in our day. And there is a science of history, and there's a lot to learn from studying the past in a kind of methodical, scholarly way. But Nietzsche talks about this, how there's different modes of history. Like there's the critical mode, there's the antiquarian mode. The critical mode is when, we don't have to get into details, but basically the mode that he thinks is the most important for men, is for men of action, which I think is all of us. It should be all of us, is on some level, is what he calls the monumental mode of history, which is basically like, imagine history as this grand statue of somebody who's larger than life. And that they weren't even that big in life. That they weren't like Hercules, maybe like David, Michelangelo's David. Maybe David probably didn't look like a jacked bodybuilder. But the fact that he's there looking like that, and you can see in his eyes in that famous statue, he's like looking out at about to throw his stone to Goliath. Like it inspires you with some kind of energy that you need. And that's what history is supposed to do. It's supposed to, like on the most basic level, it's why we transmitted stories for, millennia before we could write them down. And the stories that were transmitted, we know from anthropology, are mostly hero stories. It's stories of like great deeds of great men that, truth is very important. Plutarch really cares about truth and, evaluating the sources. But, it's almost like it's more about like the inspiration, the power that's supposed to give you the kind of moral formation, the energy. History should be like riveting if it has any, if it's worth its salt. So Nietzsche says that, he thinks young men should satisfy your souls on Plutarch. And forget the whole noisy pseudo education of our era, is what he said. I think that we do. It's sad if young men feel like they're not, like history is boring. It's probably because they just haven't had a great history teacher or haven't read some really inspiring history.
Right. And what do you think, just out of your curiosity, I just sort of my curiosity, but I'm sure some people might want to know this, but like, what do you think from your experience and your knowledge, because I know you've studied so much, why do you think like people should listen more to these heroes, and like how would you instill that into men specifically?
Yeah, I run these retreats now for my podcast listeners, men's leadership retreats. We've done them in Rome so far. We're looking at some other more stateside locations. And we focus on the art of public speaking, which is a big part of the study of history for the most of the European history. It's like you study history, you become a better communicator too, actually, which is another story. But so I was talking to one of my participants who got into my podcast somehow and was like a computer science major or something. I don't remember what he studied, but he's like a sales guy in tech, and no background in the Greeks and Romans. But I think this also gets to the question of like, why do men think about the Roman Empire, 70 times a day? I said, like, how did you get into, the podcast? How did you get into the ancient Greeks and Romans? And he said, I feel like this stuff was kept from me. And I realized only lately, he's like in his late 20s, studying the ancient Greeks and Romans, these are the greatest men who ever lived. There's something larger than life about why we turn to the ancients in particular. Because I think partly because it was such a harder world, it was so much harder to survive. You had to struggle to live past childhood. There's constant wars going on. There's all these very, very high testosterone men always challenging you for your position. You have to just like, there's this like toughness to them that just shines through, like comes right off the page. And so I think what we should do is just learn the stories. And this is one of the ways that I think Plutarch is particularly useful, why I decided to focus on him. I mean, there's a lot of great ancient historians. There's Herodotus, there's Thucydides, Sallust, Tacitus, and Julius Caesar even wrote a history of his campaigns in Gaul, and on and on and on. But Plutarch is, again, he's an ancient author. He's writing in the 1st century AD, but he's still pretty accessible. Like, he's hard to listen to, I think. He's just really dense. You got to look things up, which is one of the reasons I'm trying to redo him in audio. But what Ralph Waldo Emerson says, the great American essayist who modeled himself after Plutarch in a lot of ways, Emerson says Plutarch he's a Bible for heroes, for one thing. And he is sort of like, Emerson doesn't use this language, but he basically describes Plutarch as a gateway drug to the great tradition of the past, because it's really easy to get into a period of history by studying its great men, because, people relate to stories of individuals. They don't relate to stories of like complex, people groups and political dynamics. What you really want is like stories of suffering and overcoming and what the person learned. And, you want to come at it from one person's perspective. And I think that's why Plutarch was so popular. He's the second most popular book in all of the American colonies in the 18th century. I mean, he's incredibly popular because he's so easy to get into ancient history through the stories of the great heroes, through the Pericleses and the Lysanders and the Eumenes and the Alexanders and the Caesars and the Ciceros, rather than saying, all right, I'm going to study Roman history. And okay, 700 BC, and then you got to get to 400 AD. I mean, it's colossal. It's really worth it, but you got to find a place to start. So I think starting with individuals like that is probably the best way.
Yeah. I think you talked about this earlier, just, was reading these books. Like, I guess if like I'm a new person, and, learning about all these different subjects about history, right? What do you think, because, obviously we have a culture today that's kind of a little wacky, right? And what do you suggest to people, like, because we have a rise and fall of things, like everything gets better, things get worse, what do you suggest to people listening to this? What do you think, what do you think they should read, but also anticipate in today's society? And like, what should we do about it, you think?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, as somebody who's studying the kind of breakdown of the Roman Republic, there's a lot of interest these days in kind of, is the American Republic, declining? So, the Roman Republic is the state that a lot of the founding fathers looked to when they were putting together America's Constitution. Rome is a collective government. They vote for candidates, and office holders have 1-year term limits, and they vote on laws. And then in 31, we see roughly very complex process. Rome turns into a monarchy, what you might call a despotism, a tyranny, if you're being, hostile, or what you might call a kind of early form of kingship. Then you have the Roman emperors, right? But I think that it's really hard to say what period people are trying to say, oh, well, we're in the age of Caesar right now. It's only a few more years before we end up with a tyrant taking over because the problems are so bad, and we're just going to look to a strong man to solve all of our woes. Well, we might actually be in the period of the Gracchi brothers, who are these two populist leaders who tried to champion the people's interests against the rich. There was this great social inequality. I tell this story in this Life of Gaius Marius that I did a couple of years ago. But So, I think that it's hard to predict where exactly we are in history. Things, this isn't necessarily something I get from history, but, it's likely that things are going to get worse before they get better. And, but I think that what an enduring lesson for me is that studying the decline of civilizations and like the fall of the Roman Republic, the decline of the Athenian Empire, which was beaten by the Spartans, and like people keep living. And one of the things that will never outlive its usefulness is virtue, is being the best version of yourself, is like keeping your eyes alert and developing habits of courage and self-sufficiency. Like this is another thing that really you see this spirit in all of the men of Plutarch. They know nobody's coming to save you. It depends on you. You have to be the agent. And that's what it really means to be a free man for the Greeks and Romans is to be as highly agential as possible, to be ready for the worst things to come, to have saved up, to have the resources you need in case things break down, to have the friend network in place, to have in-person relationships in your local community. So because the ancient world is such a face-to-face world, these people have vast networks of friends and supporters, and they're out, connecting with people constantly. That's something I think that is especially important in times of potential turmoil that we are increasingly feeling like we're in. It's like, find your people. And I find a lot of great people through the internet, and you can meet them in person by traveling, or sometimes they're right around the corner and you can meet them online and find like-minded people that way. So there's a lot of tools out there, but that's something I think that any Sertorius or Sulla or young Gracchus or Lysander would be doing today is making as many friends with talented people as possible.
Totally. So I guess for me, like if you were encountering, let's say, maybe another person like myself, like a young person, like 20s, 30s, maybe even 40s. What are the four? Like, what do you think what are four advices you would give to those guys who need to be men, better men? Like, how would you answer that question?
Yeah. Well, I think Teddy Roosevelt put it really well. One is get danger, not like go and try to sell stolen planes to Saudi princes necessarily, but modern life, it's so easy to just fade into comfort and to solve your problems with any number of substances that are really going to make you dependent. The classical ideal is being the freest version of yourself, which means the most independent version of yourself. So another one would be, develop physical strength. This was a really important virtue for the Greeks in particular. They were constantly in the gymnasium, which is like originally it's like the first Western educational institution. This is where the philosophers taught. Typically, this is where they would find students. They'd go to the gymnasium, which is where the young men would be training their bodies. And the third one would be train your mind as well, and do that as part of your like physical training. Okay, I think a lot of people are getting back into health and fitness now. Don't neglect your mental training. And another thing about the gymnasium is like they would have classrooms built into the gyms in Greece and Rome, specifically for philosophical and rhetorical lectures. I think the best form of mental training from the classics perspective is training in public speaking, like training in how to address a crowd, how to carry yourself in front of other men verbally. And a foundation of that was reading history. And I think a really simple habit that I recommend to everybody, I've done an episode on this in my podcast. It's called The Best Stoic Sentences. But you can, the commonplace book. So I mentioned this earlier, but I have a book where I just, whenever I run into something that is morally improving or even just entertaining, but in a kind of like morally improving way, a great story of bravery or some witty quote, write it down in your commonplace book and spend just 5 or 10 minutes a day in the morning, either writing something down in that book or reviewing it. This is something that so many great leaders have done. We have the commonplace book of Thomas Jefferson. We have something like that for Ronald Reagan. We have so many commonplace books throughout history. In a lot of ways, a lot of Plutarch's writings are he has other writings besides the biographies. They're commonplace books, So hold on to what you find, don't just write it down, but writing can be a way, physically write it down, really, of implanting it in your mind and reviewing it so that you can share it with yourself and so that you can share it with others. If you do those 4 things on a regular basis, I think you'll see some positive results in your life.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here a part of the show. For my last question here. So I guess my last question would be where can people find you? Where can people reach out or find out more information about yourself and who you are and, learn maybe more history? Because I think we need that. Learn more history and all the things above, Well,
if I've piqued your curiosity, check out the Cost of Glory podcast. It's on all of the podcast players. It's also on YouTube. You can find me on Twitter at Cost of Glory. And I'd like to offer a little gift too to the listeners. If so, we've mentioned this a little bit about the art of public speaking, and this is something that I used to study and teach intensely when I was a professor. But I put together, if you're interested in this connection with how studying history can make you a better speaker and how you can bring those two interests together, you can go to costofglory.com/gift. And my colleague, Eric Hewitt, and I, is also a PhD in ancient stuff. We put together an authoritative speaker's guide to help you become a more authoritative speaker by learning the lessons of great men of the past, because we're trying to get the message out. So go there.
Totally.
We'd love to share that with you.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Alex. I really appreciate the time, spending almost 50 minutes, almost an hour with me. Appreciate your time. And of course, I think everyone who listens here, definitely go check him out. I think he's an amazing speaker, and also I think he's a very good educational piece that almost like a great man who should be in history books.
Maybe someday.
He educates on other historical figures. So I thank you so much for being on the show. And of course, we'll always be in touch. And thank you for joining the show.
Thanks, Josh. It's been a pleasure.